They called me a useless dropout, so my golden child brother could steal the spotlight. I stayed completely silent for 7 long years. But when his nurse looked at me and asked the one question my family never expected, my mother nearly hit the floor. Carry this up to the VIP maternity suite and do not drag your feet. The heavy designer overnight bag slammed directly into my chest. My mother Beatrice shoved it at me with enough force to knock the wind out of a lesser person. I caught the oversized leather duffel with my free hand, my other hand maintaining a firm grip on my sleek black briefcase. Jamal and Chloe need everything perfect. My mother snapped, her voice carrying an edge of sharp authority that echoed across the pristine marble floors of the hospital lobby. And since you do not have a real job, you can at least make yourself useful today. I stood there in the grand entrance of Atlanta Luxury Private Hospital, wearing a simple cream cashmere sweater and black slacks. To anyone else, I looked like an ordinary visitor. To my mother, I looked like the same subservient failed daughter she had written off 7 years ago. She straightened the collar of her immaculate church suit, her chin tilted upward in that familiar stance of absolute superiority. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply adjusted my grip on the heavy bag and watched her. As a surgeon, you learn that patience is not just a virtue, it is a weapon. You learn to watch the monitors, to wait for the exact right moment to make your incision. Today, my entire family was walking blindly into my operating room, and I was more than willing to let them prep themselves for the procedure. My mother spun on her heel and marched toward the main reception desk. She walked with the exaggerated confidence of someone desperate to prove they belonged in a place that catered to the elite. The lobby of this particular hospital was designed to resemble a five-star hotel, complete with cascading water features, ambient lighting, and staff dressed in tailored uniforms. It was the kind of place where privacy and wealth intersected, and my mother was determined to make sure everyone knew she held a ticket to the show. I followed a few paces behind her, the heavy designer bag digging into my shoulder. When we reached the expansive mahogany reception desk, the young woman behind the monitor offered a warm professional smile. "Welcome to the medical center," the receptionist said. "How may I help you today?" My mother placed both hands flat on the desk, leaning forward as if she were about to announce the arrival of royalty. "We are the Washington party," she declared loudly, ensuring the other families in the waiting area could hear her. "My son is Jamal Washington. He is bringing his wife Chloe in for her delivery. They are booked in the premier VIP maternity suite on the 7th floor." The receptionist maintained her polite smile and began typing on her keyboard. "I will just need to pull up that reservation for you, ma'am. While you are looking that up, you should know that my son runs a massive healthcare consultancy," my mother continued, her voice projecting across the quiet lobby. "He is incredibly successful. He works directly with hospital board members all over the state. In fact, his elite connections are the only reason his beautiful wife is getting this $10,000 a night suite. He knows people at the very top." I stood silently behind her, feeling the cool leather of my briefcase against my leg. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Jamal did not know anyone at the top. He certainly did not know the hospital board members. I knew this for an absolute fact, considering I sat at the head of that very board. But I kept my face perfectly blank. I had spent 7 years perfecting the art of the blank expression around my family. The receptionist paused, her typing, a slight crease appearing between her brows as she looked at the screen. "Yes, I see the reservation for a Chloe Washington in the 7th floor suite. However, I will need a credit card on file for incidentals before I can authorize the key cards." My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "My son handles all the finances. He makes more in a month than most people make in a year. He will be walking through those doors any minute, and he will provide whatever plastic you need. Just get the room ready. He expects the absolute best service." The receptionist looked uncomfortable but nodded. "I understand, ma'am. You are welcome to wait in the lounge area until he arrives." My mother turned around, her eyes sweeping over me with undisguised disdain. She looked at my plain clothes, completely missing the expensive cut of the cashmere, seeing only what she wanted to see. She turned back to the receptionist and let out a dramatic, long-suffering sigh. "You will have to excuse my daughter," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She is not exactly used to environments like this. She is a college dropout, you see. Could not handle the pressure of medical school. It was a terrible shame for our family, but thankfully my son Jamal more than makes up for it. Some children are destined for greatness, and some are just destined to carry the bags. The poor receptionist looked mortified. Her eyes darted toward me full of silent apology. She did not know what to say to a mother publicly humiliating her own child. I met the receptionist's gaze and offered a small, reassuring smile. "It is perfectly fine," I said softly. "I am just here to help my brother." My mother rolled her eyes. "Do not use that pathetic tone, Maya. You should be grateful Jamal even allows you to be part of this day. With his status, he could have hired a private assistant to handle the luggage, but he is generous enough to let you feel involved. That is the kind of man he is." I shifted the heavy duffel bag to my other shoulder. My brother Jamal, the golden child, the man who had drained my entire medical school tuition fund 7 years ago to cover the debts of his failed cryptocurrency startup. The man who had watched our father lie to the entire Atlanta community, telling our church congregation and country club friends that I had cracked under the academic pressure and quit. They had sacrificed my reputation, my dignity, and my future to protect Jamal's fragile ego and their own social standing. They thought they had buried me. They thought I had faded away into the background of life, working menial jobs and living in shame. They had absolutely no idea that I had taken that betrayal, packed my bags in the middle of the night, and worked 3 consecutive back-to-back shifts at a local diner just to afford a bus ticket out of state. They did not know I had slept in the campus library, secured independent full academic scholarships, and graduated at the very top of my class at Johns Hopkins. And they certainly did not know that the quiet, unassuming woman standing in front of them holding a diaper bag was now the chief medical officer and head of surgery for this entire hospital group. I watched my mother adjust her designer scarf, her chest puffed out with borrowed pride. I could have ended it right then. I could have reached into my pocket, pulled out my silver administrative badge, and watched the color drain from her face. I could have told the receptionist to call the hospital director down to greet me. I could have shattered my mother's arrogant delusion in a matter of seconds, but I did not. A quick victory is a cheap victory. My family had spent 7 years building an elaborate, towering monument of lies. Jamal was the wealthy healthcare mogul. Chloe was the pampered white princess brought into a high society family. My parents were the proud architects of this dynasty, and I was the shameful, useless burden they graciously tolerated. I wanted to see exactly how tall they would build this monument before I knocked out the final pillar. I wanted them to feel the full weight of their own arrogance. "Just stand over there by the fountain and stay out of the way," my mother commanded, pointing toward a quiet corner of the lobby. "When Chloe gets here, I want you to be ready to take her coat. She is very particular about her things, and considering how much this day is costing my son, you will do exactly as you are told." I walked over to the fountain. The gentle sound of rushing water masking the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. A pair of hospital security guards walked past, patrolling the lobby. The taller guard caught my eye. His posture stiffened instantly, his hand moving toward his radio as he prepared to greet me. I gave him a fraction of a shake of my head, just a tiny, imperceptible movement. The guard understood immediately. He dropped his hand, gave a short, respectful nod that my mother completely missed, and continued his patrol. I stood by the water, holding my brother's heavy luggage, waiting for the golden boy and his wife to make their grand entrance. The trap was set, the doors were about to open, and I was ready to operate. My own family threw me away and told our entire church congregation I was a medical school dropout just to protect my brother. 7 years later, they strutted into my hospital demanding VIP treatment and forced me to carry their luggage. They had absolutely no idea they were barking orders at the chief medical officer. When my head nurse finally exposed who I really was, my mother practically stopped breathing. The heavy automatic glass doors of the lobby slid open with a soft mechanical hum. The crisp morning air swept in, and with it came Chloe. She did not just walk into the hospital, she paraded into it. She was draped in an oversized designer maternity coat that probably cost more than what most of our nursing staff made in a month. Her blonde hair was styled in perfectly effortless waves, and her oversized sunglasses remained firmly on her face despite being indoors. Beatrice immediately abandoned her spot at the reception desk. My mother practically tripped over her own heels, rushing over to greet her daughter-in-law. The sheer desperation in my mother was almost painful to watch. Growing up, Beatrice had always equated proximity to wealth and certain social circles as the ultimate success. Now she was treating Chloe like visiting royalty, hoping some of that perceived high society status would rub off on her and validate the narrative she had spun for our family. "Chloe, darling," my mother cooed, reaching out to touch her arm. "We have everything handled at the front desk. Jamal said he was parking the car, but I made sure they know exactly who we are." Chloe did not even look at my mother. She barely offered a polite nod. Her gaze swept past Beatrice and landed directly on me, standing quietly by the water fountain. I was still holding her ridiculously heavy overnight duffel bag. Chloe adjusted her sunglasses and let out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance. She waddled over to me, the clicking of her designer boots echoing against the marble floor. She stopped a few inches away, bringing with her the overwhelming scent of expensive vanilla perfume and sheer entitlement. "Watch how you hold that bag!" She snapped, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of a few passing orderlies. "That is imported leather. If you crease the bottom, you are paying to replace it, and we both know you do not have that kind of money." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who was currently living a life funded by the $120,000 my brother stole from my medical school tuition. She truly believed she had married a self-made healthcare mogul. She believed Jamal was a brilliant consultant who provided her with black cards and VIP treatment. She had no idea she was married to a fraud who bankrupted his own sister to buy his way into her world. I did not blink. I did not adjust my grip on the bag. I just looked at her with the calm, detached observation of a physician examining a particularly interesting symptom. In my mind, I was already mapping out the procedure to excise this toxic presence from my life once and for all. My silence seemed to irritate her further. Chloe shifted her weight and shoved her half-empty iced coffee cup directly into my free hand. Condensation dripped down the plastic, chilling my fingers. "Toss this, sweetie," she commanded, dismissing me completely as she turned back toward the elevators. "And go tell the front desk my husband is Jamal Washington. They should be rolling out the red carpet for us by now. I am not waiting in this public lobby with all these people for another second." Beatrice immediately swooped in to run interference, shooting me a vicious glare. "You heard her, Maya," she hissed, stepping close so only I could hear. "Do not just stand there looking stupid. Throw the garbage away and make yourself useful for once in your life. Do not ruin this day for your brother." They walked away together toward the private elevators, my mother hovering around Chloe like an anxious servant. They looked so confident, so incredibly sure of their place at the top of the food chain. My mother had spent the last 7 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a failure. She had watched me pack my bags in the middle of the night, taking only what I could carry. She knew I had worked 3 back-to-back shifts at a local diner just to afford a bus ticket out of state. She knew I had slept in the campus library because I could not afford rent. Yet she chose to protect Jamal and his fabricated wealth over her own daughter. I looked down at the plastic cup, sweating in my palm. The ice rattled as I walked slowly toward the large stainless steel waste bin near the entrance. I dropped the cup inside, listening to the satisfying thud as it hit the bottom. I did not feel angry. Anger was an unpredictable emotion, a fire that consumed everything around it. What I felt was something much colder and far more precise. It was the absolute certainty of justice. Every long night, studying every moment of exhaustion, every tear I had shed when I thought I had nothing left was about to be validated. I had built an empire with my own 2 hands, while they had built a house of cards. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and selected the contact for the head of hospital security. My thumbs moved quickly over the screen. "Let the Washington party up to floor 7. Do not ask them for a credit card. Do not block their access. I want to see exactly how far they take this." I hit send and slid the phone back into my pocket. Floor 7 was not just any floor. It was the ultra-exclusive surgical and maternity ward reserved for high-profile figures, politicians, celebrities, and hospital board members. The kind of place where every room looked like a penthouse suite, and the medical care was unparalleled. It was also the floor where my primary office was located. It was my territory, my domain. I picked up the heavy designer bag once more, settling the strap onto my shoulder. I walked toward the elevators, my posture straight, my steps measured. They wanted the red carpet treatment. They wanted to pretend they owned the world while treating me like the dirt beneath their shoes. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to let them ascend all the way to the 7th floor before I cut the cables and let them free fall back to reality. I watched Jamal turn his back on me and march out of the shadowed alcove, his chest puffed out with a fragile, unearned pride. I did not move. I stayed right there in the quiet space near the linen closets, holding his wife's ridiculously heavy designer duffel bag, and I just smiled. It was a small, quiet smile born from the absolute absurdity of his delusion. He had just demanded that I act grateful because he was supposedly the one paying the bills. He truly believed he was the provider, the great savior of the Washington family name. But as I stood there listening to his polished loafers click against the marble floor, my mind pulled me back to the exact moment he became the family hero and the exact price I had been forced to pay for his crown. 7 years ago, there were no flashy suits or boastful demands. 7 years ago, Jamal was sitting at our parents' sprawling mahogany dining table, sobbing into his hands like a terrified child. His grand, heavily funded cryptocurrency startup had collapsed in a spectacular blaze of incompetence and fraud. He had leveraged money he did not have borrowed from people he should have never spoken to, and the collectors were threatening to take my parents' house to settle his debts. I remember standing in the doorway of that dining room watching my father Calvin pace the floor, his face gray with panic. My mother Beatrice was hovering over Jamal, stroking his hair, assuring her golden boy that everything was going to be fine. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately to keep Jamal out of federal prison and to protect the flawless reputation they had spent decades building in Atlanta's high society. Their solution was simple. They took my money. Without my permission, without even a conversation, my father forged my signature and drained my medical school trust fund. $120,000, the money meant to cover my final years at Johns Hopkins, vanished overnight to pay off Jamal's catastrophic mistakes. When I discovered the zero balance, I confronted them. I stood in that same dining room, clutching my bank statements, begging them to tell me it was a banking error. My father did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that family protects family. He told me I could just take out student loans like everyone else, completely ignoring the fact that my credit was tied to the accounts he had just gutted. But the theft was not the ultimate insult. The ultimate insult came a week later when the whispers started at our prominent church and around the country club. People were asking why I was not packing my bags to return to Baltimore for the fall semester. They were asking why Maya was suddenly looking for shift work at local diners. To save face, to ensure no one ever suspected that their golden boy had bankrupted the family, my father stood up at the pulpit during a Sunday morning testimony. He looked out over a packed sanctuary of our friends, mentors, and community leaders. He shook his head with manufactured grief, wiping a fake tear from his eye, and asked the congregation to pray for his daughter. He lied to hundreds of people, claiming the academic pressure of medical school had simply been too much for my fragile mind. He told them I had suffered a breakdown and dropped out. They sacrificed my reputation, my dignity, and my future, all to build a firewall around Jamal. They branded me a failure so he could continue pretending to be a success. And now, 7 years later, this same brother had the audacity to pin me against a hospital wall and tell me to be grateful that he was paying the bills. I smoothed a microscopic piece of lint from my cashmere sweater and adjusted the strap of the heavy bag on my shoulder. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled me back to the present. These footsteps were heavier, slower, and far more arrogant than Jamal's. My father Calvin stepped into the alcove. He looked exactly the same as he did 7 years ago, perhaps with a little more silver at his temples, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed old Atlanta money. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes sweeping over my plain clothes with profound disappointment. He did not step forward to hug me. He did not ask how I had been. He looked at me the same way one might look at a stain on a pristine carpet. "What are you doing hiding in the shadows?" Maya, my father demanded, his voice thick with condescension. Your brother's wife is out there expecting service, and you are skulking around the hallways. Jamal wanted a private word, I replied, my voice perfectly level. My father let out a heavy, exhausted sigh, a sound I had grown up loathing. It was the sound he made whenever he was forced to deal with something beneath his pay grade. Well, make yourself useful. Do not just stand there taking up space. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick sterling silver money clip. He peeled back the bills purposefully, bypassing the hundreds and fifties, and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. He held it out between his index and middle finger. Go down to the cafeteria and get us some real food, my father commanded. Chloe is hungry, and the catering in this place is taking too long. I looked at the crumpled $20 bill. $20 would not even cover a bottle of water and a sandwich at the artisan cafe downstairs. But to my father, it was exactly what he believed my time and presence were worth. Take it, he snapped, growing impatient with my stillness. Go do something productive. You do not belong hovering around a high-class medical ward like this anyway. Go make yourself useful. He did not wait for me to reach out and take the money. He simply flicked his wrist, tossing the crumpled bill at my chest. I watched the green paper hit my sweater and begin its slow, fluttering descent toward the polished floor. Time seemed to drag the bill, drifting back and forth in the sterile air of the alcove. Before the $20 bill even touched the marble tile, the silence of the seventh floor was shattered. A shrill, piercing alarm erupted from the overhead speakers, echoing down the pristine hallway with deafening urgency. Red strobe lights began flashing above the nurse's station just outside the alcove. It was a sound that triggered an immediate visceral reaction in anyone who wore a white coat. Code Blue, Surgical Intensive Care, Room 714, Code Blue. The automated voice blared through the speakers, repeating the room number. Room 714 was just down the hall, less than 50 feet from where I stood. In a fraction of a second, the submissive, silent daughter my family thought they knew completely ceased to exist. Muscle memory and years of brutal, relentless trauma training took over. The facade dropped. The polite smile vanished. I did not hesitate. I let the heavy designer duffel bag slip from my shoulder. I did not set it down gently. I let it drop straight to the floor. The expensive imported leather hit the hard marble with a loud, satisfying smack, right next to my father's crumpled $20 bill. What are you doing? My father yelled, jumping back as the bag narrowly missed his polished shoes. Pick that up right now. I ignored him completely. My posture shifted from relaxed to an absolute commanding authority. I pushed past my father, clipping his shoulder hard enough to spin him out of my way, and sprinted out of the alcove. I burst into the main waiting area just as nurses and orderlies were sprinting down the corridor with a crash cart. Jamal was standing by the reception desk, his mouth hanging open as the chaotic symphony of a medical emergency unfolded around him. He saw me sprinting past the desk, my face locked in intense concentration. Maya, get back here! Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic and indignation. What are you doing? Where are you going? I did not look back. I did not slow down. I ran straight toward the flashing red light of room 714, diving directly into the life-or-death chaos, leaving my shouting, bewildered family in the dust behind me. It took exactly 47 minutes to stabilize the patient in room 714. 47 minutes of intense synchronized medical intervention, chest compressions, epinephrine, and clear, decisive orders, barked to a trauma team that moved flawlessly under my direct command. When the patient finally had a steady and strong rhythm, the heavy adrenaline of the code blue slowly washed out of my system. It left behind the cool, sharp focus that defined my entire career. I stepped into the adjacent scrub room, washed my hands thoroughly in the stainless steel sink, and watched the soap and water swirl down the drain. I dried my hands, walked down the hall to my private locker in the executive physician lounge, and pulled out my freshly pressed white coat. Slipping my arms into the crisp, heavy cotton felt like putting on a suit of armor. I draped my stethoscope around my neck and checked my reflection in the mirror. I was no longer the submissive, silent daughter playing the convenient role of the family scapegoat. I was the chief medical officer, and it was finally time to check on the Washington party. I made my way back down the pristine, quiet corridor toward the premier VIP maternity suite room 702. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar, and even from the hallway, I could hear the absolute meltdown happening inside. The suite itself was designed to rival a luxury penthouse. It featured a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a private living area with plush leather sofas, catered dining services, and a spa-quality bathroom. It was a space designed for peace and ultimate comfort, but my family had already turned it into a war zone. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside, my white coat swishing softly around my knees. The scene before me was beautifully chaotic. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the extravagant, oversized hospital bed, her face buried in her hands, sobbing loudly. Her designer maternity coat was tossed carelessly over a chair. My mother, Beatrice, was hovering over her, frantically offering tissues and promising that everything was going to be fixed right away. And then there was Jamal. My brother was pacing the length of the suite, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He had his cell phone pressed so hard against his ear, it looked painful, and he was screaming at whatever unfortunate billing administrator was on the other end of the line. "What do you mean my card declined?" Jamal bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "Run it again. Run it manually. I am a highly respected healthcare consultant in this city. You do not place a hard hold on my wife in her room. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have your nursing staff walk in here and ask my pregnant wife for a different form of payment?" Jamal was unraveling. The grand illusion of his limitless wealth was cracking under the unforgiving weight of the hospital automated billing system. The $10,000 a night suite required a substantial hold for incidentals, and Jamal and his precious black card had bounced straight back. He was running on empty, leveraging credit he simply did not have, and the hospital financial department was not impressed by his loud voice or his cheap, ill-fitting suit. "Jamal, make them fix it right now," Chloe wailed, slapping her hand against the mattress. "The nurse actually told me I have to leave this suite if the card does not clear. She offered me a standard room." "A standard room, Jamal. I am not sharing a recovery floor with regular people. You promised me the red carpet. You promised me luxury." "I will handle it, babe," Jamal shouted back, sweat forming on his forehead. He turned back to his phone, practically growling into the receiver. "Listen to me very carefully. If you do not authorize this room immediately, I am going to call the chief medical officer and have you and everyone in your department fired before lunch." Before Jamal could notice I had entered the room, my mother spun around. Her eyes landed on me, and for a fraction of a second she looked completely confused. She took in the pristine white physician coat, the embroidered hospital logo on the breast pocket, and the heavy stethoscope resting around my neck. But her brain, heavily conditioned by 7 years of her own deliberate lies, simply refused to process the reality right in front of her. Instead of questioning why the highly trained hospital staff allowed me to walk around dressed like an executive physician, she jumped straight to the most malicious and absurd conclusion possible. "What in the world are you wearing?" Beatrice hissed, stomping across the plush carpet toward me. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. "Are you out of your mind, Maya? Take that off right now before someone sees you." I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly in my pockets. I did not break eye contact. "Take what off?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of the panic or shame she was trying so desperately to incite. "That coat," she snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so she would not interrupt Jamal and his screaming match on the phone. "You are playing dress-up in stolen hospital property. Are you trying to get arrested? Or are you just so pathetic, so desperate for attention, that you have to pretend to be a doctor to make yourself look important in front of Chloe?" I looked over at my sister-in-law, who had lifted her tear-streaked face from her hands to glare at me. Chloe looked utterly humiliated, furious that her grand high society arrival had been ruined by declined credit cards and questioning nurses. My mother was trying to use me as a convenient punching bag to deflect from the massive embarrassment of the situation. "You have always been jealous of your brother," my mother continued, stepping even closer, her eyes blazing with irrational anger. "You dropped out, you failed, and now you are standing here in a stolen doctor coat making an absolute fool of yourself while Jamal is trying to sort out a simple banking error. Take it off before I call security myself and tell them you are a thief. You are not a doctor, Maya. You are just a dropout who carries bags." I listened to her venomous words, feeling the cool, smooth fabric of my coat against my arms. It was fascinating to witness the depths of her denial. She was so terrified of the truth, so deeply invested in the fake reality where Jamal was a king and I was a peasant, that she literally could not see the chief medical officer standing right in front of her. Meanwhile, Jamal was losing the battle with the billing department. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in pure disbelief as the call disconnected. The billing administrator had hung up on him. He tossed his phone onto the bedside table and ran his trembling hands over his face, breathing heavily. The walls were closing in on him rapidly. The suite he could not afford was slipping through his fingers, and his wife was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing rage. I remained standing near the doorway, watching the beautiful, chaotic collapse of their fake empire. I did not take off the white coat. I did not defend myself against my mother and her absurd accusations of theft. I simply waited because the very best part of my operation was just about to begin. The room was suffocatingly tense. Jamal had just slammed his phone onto the bedside table, running his hands over his sweating face in a frantic, erratic motion. The billing administrator had hung up on him. Chloe was hyperventilating on the oversized mattress, clutching her designer blankets, terrified she would be moved to a standard floor with regular patients. My mother, Beatrice, was still glaring at me, waiting for me to strip off the white coat she assumed I had stolen from a supply closet. Her chest heaved with indignation, her eyes wide with a manic need to maintain control over the room. "Did you not hear me, Maya?" she demanded, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss. "Take off that ridiculous costume. You are making an absolute mockery of this family." I did not look at my mother. My focus was entirely on Jamal. He was vibrating with a dangerous mix of humiliation and rage. He turned his attention back to his sobbing wife, pacing at the foot of her extravagant hospital bed like a caged animal. "I am going to destroy them," Jamal announced to the room, his voice shaking with absolute fury. He pointed a finger toward the heavy oak doors of the suite. "Do they know who I am? I will have the entire administrative staff cleared out by the end of the day. I am going to march down to the executive offices right now, contact the chief medical officer, and demand every single person involved in this billing mistake is fired immediately." I was practically foaming at the mouth. He adjusted his collar, trying to regain the posture of a powerful, untouchable executive. But he just looked like a desperate man, drowning in a shallow pool of his own lies. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the suite was thick with the scent of Chloe's expensive vanilla perfume and the sterile, clean smell of hospital-grade sanitizer. I stepped away from the doorway. My pristine white coat shifted around my legs as I walked across the plush carpet, moving directly into the center of the room. I approached the mahogany bedside table where Jamal had tossed his wallet and his phone. Resting right next to a silver tray of untouched complimentary sparkling water was the source of his current destruction. His prestigious heavy metal black card, the one that had just bounced and triggered a hard hold on his VIP experience. I reached out and picked it up. The metal felt cold and heavy against my fingertips. I turned the card over in my hand, feeling the raised numbers, looking at my brother's name printed across the front. A name our parents had practically worshipped for 34 years. A name they had sacrificed my future to protect. "Put that down!" Jamal snapped, stepping toward me. His eyes were wide with a sudden frantic energy. He did not like me holding his possessions. He did not like me invading the space he believed he commanded. "Do not touch my things, Maya. You have no business touching anything in this room. You are just here to carry bags." I did not drop the card. I did not flinch. I closed the distance between us, stopping just 2 feet away from his sweating, angry face. I held the metal credit card out to him, extending my hand perfectly steady. He snatched it from my fingers with a rough, aggressive jerk. "Funny thing about the chief medical officer, Jamal," I said. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of the fear he was so used to seeing in my eyes. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. They do not usually take calls from overdrawn accounts. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a split second, total confusion washed over his face. He blinked, trying to process what I had just said. He looked at the credit card in his hand, then back up at my face, then down to the embroidered hospital logo on the breast pocket of my white coat. And then the confusion shattered. The fragile paper-thin illusion of his superiority evaporated, replaced by a blinding, explosive rage. The realization that I was mocking his financial ruin, that the useless sister he had brought along to carry luggage was looking down at him with pure, unadulterated pity, broke something deep inside his fragile ego. He was a narcissist who had just been publicly stripped of his armor, and he reacted the only way a cornered coward knows how. His face twisted into a mask of pure vicious fury. A guttural sound ripped from his throat, completely abandoning any pretense of the sophisticated gentleman he had been playing for his white wife. "You worthless little Jamal," roared, his features contorting with violent anger. He lunged toward me. He closed the remaining distance in a fraction of a second, raising his right hand high into the air, fully intending to strike me right across the face. He wanted to physically put me back in my place, to beat me back down into the submissive, silent girl he had stolen from 7 years ago. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I simply stood my ground, my eyes locked on his, completely unbothered by his sudden explosion of violence. Before Jamal's hand could even begin its downward arc, a massive, solid force intercepted him. The heavy, sweet door had swung open silently moments before, and standing right behind my brother was Officer Terrence. He was the lead of our 7th floor security detail, a towering former military man who took his job on the VIP surgical ward with absolute seriousness. Officer Terrence stepped firmly into Jamal's path, moving with terrifying speed and precision. He grabbed Jamal's raised wrist in a grip that looked like a vise of solid steel, stopping the strike dead in its tracks. With his other, Terrence simultaneously stepped into Jamal's personal space, using his broad chest to physically block my brother from getting an inch closer to me. Jamal let out a shocked gasp as his arm was wrenched backward. He stumbled, losing his footing on the plush carpet, his expensive leather loafers skidding out from under him. He tried to pull his arm free, his face turning an even darker shade of red, but Terrence did not budge. The security guard stood like a brick wall, his posture radiating a quiet, lethal warning. "Sir," Officer Terrence said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that demanded instant compliance, "I strongly suggest you lower your hand and step back immediately." To emphasize his point, Terrence smoothly shifted his stance, dropping his free hand down to rest firmly on the heavy tactical belt at his waist, his fingers brushing the edge of his radio and defensive equipment. It was a clear, unmistakable, universal signal. One more aggressive move, one more raised voice, and Jamal was going to find himself face down on the luxury carpeting, with his hands restrained behind his back. The sudden, overwhelming presence of physical authority completely derailed my brother. Violent outburst. Jamal froze his chest, heaving his eyes, darting frantically between the imposing security guard and my perfectly calm face. He slowly lowered his arm as Terrence released his grip, stumbling backward until the back of his knees hit the edge of Chloe's hospital bed. Chloe let out a terrified shriek, pulling her legs up and wrapping her arms around her pregnant belly. She had spent her entire marriage believing Jamal was a powerful, untouchable force in the corporate world. Watching him get physically dominated and manhandled by a security guard who was protecting the sister he had called a trash boy completely shattered her perception of him. My mother, who had been completely silent during the brief scuffle, pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer panic as she stared at the heavily armed guard standing in the middle of their expensive suite. Once Jamal was safely backed away, creating a wide buffer of space, Officer Terrence turned his broad shoulders slightly. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at the crying woman on the bed, or the sweating, terrified man cowering against the mattress. He turned his attention entirely to me. He stood at strict attention, gave a sharp, respectful nod, and spoke with absolute professional reverence. "Is everything all right in here, Dr. Washington?" The title echoed through the massive suite, bouncing off the panoramic windows and the high, pristine ceilings. It hung in the air, thick and undeniable. "Dr. Washington." I smoothed the lapel of my pristine white coat, ensuring the embroidered Chief Medical Officer title sat perfectly flat against my chest. I offered Terrence a small, appreciative smile. "Everything is perfectly under control, Terrence," I replied, my voice steady and serene. Mr. Washington was just experiencing a moment of high emotional stress regarding his billing issues. He understands that any further aggressive behavior will result in an immediate escort off hospital property. I turned my gaze back to Jamal. He looked as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. He was staring at me, really staring at me, his eyes tracking from the heavy stethoscope around my neck to the silver executive badge clipped to my pocket. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. He was standing in my hospital. He was bankrupt, and he had just tried to assault the woman who held the power to throw him out onto the street. The absolute silence in the suite was deafening, broken only by the sound of Chloe's soft, panicked weeping. My family was entirely trapped, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift in power waiting for my very next move. The absolute silence in the VIP suite was a fragile and temporary thing. It was the sound of a family collective reality shattering into a million sharp pieces. Jamal stood completely frozen, his eyes glued to the silver executive badge clipped to my white coat. The words Dr. Washington were still ringing in the air, echoing off the expensive artwork and the high ceilings. Then, predictably, my mother broke the silence. Beatrice Washington was a woman who had spent her entire adult life bending reality to fit her preferred narrative. If a fact did not align with her worldview, she simply rejected it. She had convinced herself that her son was a corporate genius and her daughter was a worthless failure. The idea that her scapegoat daughter was actually an executive physician was a fact her brain completely refused to process. It went against everything she had preached to her friends at the country club. My mother lunged forward, her designer heels sinking deep into the plush carpet. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at Officer Terrence. "How much is she paying you?" Beatrice shrieked. Her voice reached a pitch that made Chloe wince on the hospital bed. "Did she bribe you to say that?" She turned her furious, manic gaze back to me. "You think this is funny, Maya? You think you can just buy off a security guard to play along with your little sick fantasy just because you are jealous of your brother?" Beatrice marched right up to Terrence, completely ignoring the fact that he was a heavily armed, highly trained professional. She tilted her chin up, trying to use her fierce church lady glare to intimidate a man who dealt with violent hospital incidents on a daily basis. "Officer, I demand that you arrest this woman immediately," my mother ordered. "She is not a doctor. She is a college dropout who could not handle the pressure of real life. She stole that white coat from a supply closet. She stole that badge. She is impersonating a medical professional, and she just tried to violently assault my highly successful son." Officer Terrence did not move a single muscle. He looked down at my mother with a mixture of profound confusion and mild professional pity. He did not reach for his handcuffs. He did not reach for his radio to call for backup. He just stood there, a solid wall of absolute loyalty to the hospital administration, looking at a woman who was clearly losing her grip on reality. "Ma'am," Terrence said, his voice deep and rumbling, "I strongly suggest you lower your voice. You are in a maternity recovery ward, and you are causing a massive disturbance." Beatrice gasped loudly, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. She was deeply offended that a security guard would dare correct her tone. "Do you know who my son is?" she screamed, gesturing wildly toward Jamal, who was still staring at my badge like it was radioactive. "My son brings millions of dollars into this city. He plays golf with the board of directors of this very hospital. I want this imposter arrested right now, or I will make one phone call and have your badge taken away before lunch." I watched her self-destruct with total emotional detachment. 7 years ago, her screaming would have sent me into a terrifying spiral of anxiety. Back then, I would have apologized profusely. I would have shrunk myself down to make her comfortable. I would have accepted the blame just to keep the peace. Now I just felt a clinical fascination. She was so desperate to protect the lie she had built around Jamal that she was willing to have her own flesh and blood thrown in jail. She was willing to accuse me of a felony just to keep her golden boy on his imaginary pedestal. It was pathetic. It was incredibly sad. But most importantly, it was no longer my problem to fix. Seeing that his wife was getting absolutely nowhere with the security guard, my father decided it was time to step in. Calvin always believed he was the ultimate authority in any room he entered. He was a man who ruled our household with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and handing out harsh punishments to anyone who questioned his image. He walked over to my mother, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder to pull her back. "Let me handle this, Beatrice," my father said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Terence with pure, unfiltered condescension. "Clearly, the security staff at this facility is completely incompetent. If you will not remove this trespasser from my daughter-in-law, private suite, I will do it myself." Calvin rolled back the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me. His eyes were dark with the same toxic anger I had seen the night he lied to our church congregation about my academic career. He fully intended to grab me by the collar of my pristine white coat and physically drag me out into the hallway. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the nursing staff, to prove that no matter what clothes I wore, he was still the one in control. "You are going to walk out of that door right now," Maya, my father growled, taking another step forward. "Or I am going to throw you out myself." Officer Terence immediately shifted his weight, moving smoothly and silently to intercept my father. Terence planted his boots firmly between Calvin and me, raising one large hand in a strict halt gesture. "Sir, if you take one more step toward the chief medical officer, you will be leaving this hospital in the back of a police cruiser," Terence warned, his tone dropping all pretense of customer service. "Do not test me." Calvin's face turned purple with rage. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, bracing his feet as if he might actually try to shove the massive security guard out of his way to get to me. But before my father could make the absolute worst mistake of his life, a loud, sharp noise broke the terrible tension in the room. The heavy oak double doors of the VIP suite swung violently open, hitting the rubber wall stopper with a loud thud. Everyone in the room jumped. Calvin froze mid-step. Beatrice gasped and clutched her pearl necklace. Jamal flinched backward, bumping hard against the hospital bed. Standing in the doorway was Valerie. Valerie was a veteran charge nurse, a strong African-American woman who had been running the 7th floor surgical wing for nearly 2 decades. She was the kind of nurse who tolerated zero nonsense from anyone, whether they were demanding patients, arrogant surgeons, or loud families. Right now, Valerie looked completely out of breath. Her navy blue scrubs were slightly rumpled, and she was clutching a glowing medical tablet tightly against her chest. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, taking in the bizarre scene of my angry father facing off with hospital security. But Valerie did not address my father. She did not look at my screaming mother. She did not even glance at the weeping Chloe or the sweating, terrified Jamal. Valerie looked straight past all of them. Her eyes locked directly onto me, bringing with her the absolute, undeniable truth that was about to finally shatter my family's entire universe. The heavy oak doors bounced off the rubber wall stopper with a loud, resounding thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the luxury suite. Valerie stood in the threshold, her chest heaving slightly under her navy blue scrubs. As the veteran charge nurse of the 7th floor, she possessed a commanding presence that usually demanded immediate respect from anyone in her vicinity. Her eyes swept the room with laser precision, cutting through the thick, toxic tension my family had spent the last 20 minutes building. My father, Calvin, immediately puffed out his chest, stepping back from his aggressive standoff with Officer Terence. Calvin smoothed the front of his tailored charcoal suit, clearly assuming this sudden interruption was finally the hospital administration rushing in to grovel and apologize for the horrific inconvenience his family had suffered. He manufactured a look of stern, righteous indignation, completely oblivious to the reality of his situation. "It is about time someone with some authority showed up to handle this mess," Calvin barked, pointing a stiff, authoritative finger directly at Valerie. "Nurse, I need you to instruct this security guard to step aside right now. Then you are going to help us remove this trespassing woman from my daughter-in-law private suite before I am forced to escalate this to the hospital board." Jamal instantly jumped in, adjusting his cheap tie and trying to ride our father wave of misplaced confidence. His face was still slick with the sweat of his declined credit card, but his arrogance knew absolutely no bounds. "And while you are at it, get your billing department on the phone immediately," Jamal demanded, projecting his voice to sound as intimidating as possible. "I am Jamal Washington." The level of blatant disrespect my pregnant wife has experienced today is entirely unacceptable and it is going to cost people their jobs. Chloe sniffled loudly from the hospital bed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the role of the victimized high society wife. My mother. Beatrice stood tall, crossing her arms over her chest, a smug, satisfied smirk creeping back onto her face. They truly believed the cavalry had arrived. They believed Valerie was there to validate their delusions of grandeur and put me back in my designated place as the family failure. Valerie did not even blink. She had been running surgical wards for 2 decades. She had managed mass casualty events, coordinated complex organ transplants, and dealt with the most demanding, arrogant surgeons on the eastern seaboard. Two loud men in cheap suits throwing a temper tantrum in a maternity suite did not even register as a blip on her professional radar. Valerie stepped fully into the lavish room, the thick rubber soles of her clinical shoes entirely silent against the plush carpeting. She did not look at my father. She did not acknowledge Jamal or his frantic demands about billing. She completely ignored my mother Beatrice, who was waiting for an apology that would never come. Valerie parted the sea of my toxic family as if they were nothing more than invisible, insignificant ghosts. She walked with the singular, terrifying focus of a medical professional carrying critical information. She marched straight past Calvin, brushing so close to him that the breeze of her movement fluttered his expensive silk tie. She walked right past Jamal, leaving him standing with his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence. She bypassed the extravagant hospital bed where Chloe was putting on her theatrical display of distress. Valerie stopped directly in front of me. The air in the suite seemed to instantly freeze. The temperature plummeted. My family watched in total, absolute confusion as this veteran charge nurse, a woman who carried immense authority on the executive floor, completely bypassed the wealthy clients to stand at strict attention in front of the supposed bag carrier. Valerie's posture shifted the moment she stopped. Her shoulders squared and her expression transformed from frantic urgency into one of deep, unwavering professional reverence. She held out the glowing medical tablet, presenting it to me with both hands, the screen illuminating the crisp, clean fabric of my pristine white coat. Dr. Washington, Valerie said, her voice clear, respectful, and carrying flawlessly across the dead silent room. I am so deeply sorry to interrupt your family time today, but we need your executive override authorization on the surgical wing immediately. I looked down at the tablet, feeling the cool, familiar weight of my silver stethoscope resting against my neck. I kept my face completely serene, projecting the absolute calm of a leader in her element, while inside my heart was soaring. 7 years of silence. 7 years of grinding, relentless, back-breaking work. 7 years of letting them believe their malicious lies. It was all culminating in this exact, perfect sequence of words. The trauma patient from room 714 has stabilized. Valerie continued tapping a specific line on the digital chart for me to review. However, the pharmacy department is requiring direct executive approval for the experimental clotting agents we pushed during the code. We cannot proceed with the secondary surgical prep until you sign off on the pharmaceutical release. I reached out and took the tablet from her hands. The silence that fell over the luxury VIP suite was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating, paralyzing silence. It was the kind of terrifying quiet that happens right after an explosion, in that brief suspended moment before the dust begins to settle and the full extent of the devastation is revealed. My father stood frozen in the middle of the room, his arm still partially raised from where he had been pointing at the door. His eyes darted wildly from Valerie to the tablet in my hands, trying to comprehend a reality that broke every single rule he had established for his universe. Jamal looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. The aggressive, boastful posture he had maintained for the last hour completely collapsed. He stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, the realization of what was happening hitting him with the force of a freight train. He was a bankrupt fraud standing in a $10,000 a night suite that he could not afford, and the sister he had just tried to physically assault was currently authorizing experimental drugs for an intensive care unit. Chloe dropped the tissue she had been using to dab her eyes. It fluttered down to the designer blankets. She looked at Jamal, then looked at me, a profound, dawning horror washing over her pale face. But it was my mother who broke first. Beatrice Washington possessed a brain that was perfectly, immaculately wired to reject any reality where I was anything other than a spectacular failure. She relied on the narrative of the college dropout to survive. Her entire social standing, her pride, and her identity as a successful mother were built on the foundation of Jamal greatness and my perceived uselessness. Hearing a highly respected charge nurse call me Dr. Washington shattered her entire worldview into irreparable pieces, her brain completely short-circuited. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. She lunged forward, her designer heels sinking into the carpet, completely bypassing Calvin and Jamal. She stopped just a few feet away from me, and Valerie pointing a visibly shaking hand directly at my chest. Dr. Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking, her perfectly styled hair trembling with the sheer force of her denial. "What on earth are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? She is not a doctor." Valerie turned her head slowly, looking at my mother, with a mixture of profound confusion and intense clinical concern. Valerie was used to dealing with patients who were confused by medication or trauma, and she looked at my mother as if she was displaying symptoms of a severe neurological event. My mother did not notice the nurse's concerned expression. She was too busy trying to forcibly construct her fake reality out of thin air. She stepped closer, her eyes manic, her breathing shallow and fast. "She is a college dropout!" Beatrice yelled, her voice echoing wildly off the panoramic windows. She could not handle medical school. She cracked under the pressure 7 years ago and threw her entire life away. She has been working at diners and living in squalor. She is only here today to carry my daughter-in-law luggage. The sheer desperation in my mother's voice was pathetic. She was begging Valerie to agree with her. She was pleading with the universe to maintain the lies she had fed to our church congregation, to our extended family, and to her friends at the country club. If I was a doctor, if I was standing here with the authority to command a surgical wing, it meant my mother was not just a liar. It meant she had willingly sacrificed her own daughter to protect a fraud. Valerie looked from my mother, manic, sweating face, back to me. The charge nurse raised an eyebrow, silently asking if she needed to call for a psychiatric consult for the screaming woman in the designer dress. I offered Valerie a slow, calm, deeply reassuring smile. I lifted the digital stylus, signed my name with a smooth, practiced flourish on the bottom of the glowing screen, and handed the tablet back to her. My signature authorized thousands of dollars in life-saving medication with a single stroke of a pen. I did not look at my mother. I did not address her screaming, frantic denial. I simply focused entirely on the nurse standing in front of me, radiating the absolute, unquestionable power of my position. I let my mother's frantic, desperate lies hang in the sterile air, waiting for the final crushing blow to be delivered. Valerie held the medical tablet against her chest. She stood completely still, letting my mother's frantic, unhinged echo fade into the soundproof walls of the luxury maternity suite. As a veteran charge nurse, Valerie had witnessed every kind of human breakdown imaginable. She had seen grief, panic, and profound shock. But what she was looking at right now was pure, unfiltered delusion, and she had absolutely zero patience for it. Valerie turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto my mother's face. She looked at Beatrice not with anger, but with the profound, clinical pity you reserve for someone who has completely lost their grip on reality. "Excuse me," Valerie said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "Did you just call Dr. Washington a college dropout?" My mother nodded frantically, her designer earrings shaking with the rapid movement. "Yes, she dropped out 7 years ago. She is just here to carry my daughter-in-law luggage. You have made a mistake. She is not a doctor." Valerie looked back at me, then back to my mother. "Ma'am, are you asking if she is the chief doctor? Because let me make this incredibly clear for you. Dr. Maya Washington is not just a doctor. She is the chief medical officer and the head of surgery for this entire hospital group. She oversees every single physician in this building. She is the reason this surgical ward even exists." The delivery of those words was flawless. Valerie did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The absolute truth carried its own devastating, undeniable weight. The room went dead silent. It was not just a pause in conversation. It was an absolute vacuum of sound, the kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes it physically hard to breathe. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. The only sound in the massive VIP suite was the faint rhythmic hum of the fetal heart monitor resting next to Chloe's hospital bed. I let the silence stretch. I let it wrap around my family like a heavy, suffocating blanket. This was the exact moment their 7-year lie officially died. My eyes drifted downward, landing on the floor near my father-polished leather shoes. Resting right there on the pristine marble tile just outside the carpeted area was the crumpled $20 bill Calvin had thrown at me earlier. The money he had tossed at my chest, ordering me to go down to the cafeteria and fetch them food because I did not belong on a high-class medical ward. That $20 bill now looked like the most pathetic, ridiculous object in the world. It was a monument to their arrogance, lying in the dirt exactly where it belonged. I shifted my gaze to Chloe. She was sitting propped up against her pillows, her hands still clutching the designer blankets. Her jaw had literally dropped. Her mouth hung open as she stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of pure terror and profound humiliation. She had spent the last hour treating me like an incompetent servant. She had shoved her garbage into my hands. She had snapped at me for wrinkling her overnight bag. Now, the realization that she had been barking orders at the head of the hospital was washing over her in real time. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, and she shrank back against the headboard, trying to make herself as small as possible. Then I looked at Jamal. My brother, the golden child. The supposed healthcare mogul. The man who had backed me into a corner just 20 minutes ago and told me to be grateful he was paying the bills. Jamal had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. All the false bravado, all the loud, boisterous energy he used to dominate every room he entered had completely evaporated. His shoulders slumped forward. His breathing was shallow and fast. He looked at the silver executive badge clipped to my white coat, reading my name and title over